Very good afternoon to absolutely everyone. A very good Monday afternoon to everyone. Thank you again for joining us for the ICDM webinar series. Now, we are having this webinar, interestingly enough, as Malaysia actually starts to open up again very slowly. I think it's quite ironic that on Labor Day, our main instruction was apparently to go back to work. But that joking aside, Malaysia is certainly opening herself up. And I think a lot of us are having a little bit of Stockholm syndrome, why all of us were actually quite happy to, because a lot of us did worry about isolation, missing our colleagues, working with everything. But now that it's here, I think a lot of us are also like, I actually wonder if I can go back to the way it was. But anyway, we will talk about that in detail. But before we start, I have to get the housekeeping out of the way. As you've joined us, you realize that your mic is automatically muted, but there are ways of contacting us. The Zoom tab below has two tabs. One is the Q&A and one is for chat. Questions for our lovely gentlemen will all go into the Q&A tab. We'll answer them at the end of the session. But any other sort of queries, technical difficulties, more information, especially on some new classes coming up, please feel free to drop us a chat. This entire session is recorded. The copy will be sent to you after. And if you wish to leave the webinar session, you'll be able to rejoin if it is still in progress. Welcome to part 2 of this webinar entitled Navigating COVID-19 Crisis and the New Normal of the Workforce. We have 3 gentlemen from Willis Towers Watson again today. Let me introduce them. You can see on your screen Shai Kanu, who's MD, Global Leader, Executive Compensation and Governance. You have Lim Chin Han, who's MD and Country Head from Malaysia. And of course, you have Tan Juan Jim, who's Country Leader, Talents and Rewards Businesses. As I mentioned, it's a great thing that we're actually talking now about the new normal workforce in COVID-19 because we've tackled working from home. How do we tackle going back to work and the weird hybrid of the in-between? And with that, I hand it over to Shagaran to take it over.
Thank you, Nadia. What a perfect introduction to today's discussion. Thank you very much for setting that up. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure being here again with you with part 2 of this series of navigating the new normal of the workforce. And Nadia stole a bit of my thunder because the context is perfect. I'm based in Singapore, for those of you who don't know, and we are looking at Malaysia with a little bit of envy, given Malaysia is likely to return or releasing some of the working from home restrictions, whereas Singapore still continues to be in our circuit breaker till end of May. But this is essentially, I think, a good segue to talk about navigating the new normal. When we met last time in part 1 of the webinar, we shared with you a framework that Willis Towers Watson has worked with the World Economic Forum in dealing with COVID-19 and specifically the human capital issues related to COVID-19. We spoke about 3 broad steps as we look at the COVID-19 pandemic and how companies are reacting or rather addressing the human capital issues. The 3 steps were, number 1, managing through the crisis, which is the immediate focus, cash preservation, what do we do in the short term? Number 2, restoring stability. So as companies, economies, businesses, societies go through a little bit of a dip, once the shock value has passed, what are some of the immediate actions that we do to restore stability? And if you recall, the last time when we met, we covered these 2 areas in a lot more detail. What we want to cover today is the 3rd step in this continuum, which is operating post-crisis. And operating post-crisis, Chinhan and Jim will share more details with you. What we've tried to do here is cover today's webinar in a few buckets. Bucket 1 being operating post-crisis that has some guiding principles and guiding principles about what can companies do in the medium to long term. How do they think about their workforce in the future? The phrase that we're using is HR 4.0. So how do you think about human capital as important an asset as your physical and financial capital? But specifically, and what I think will be of a lot of interest to participants on the call, is what specific implications does this have in the Malaysian context? So not just sharing the principles and what we're seeing globally, but also what implications would this have for Malaysia? So without further ado, I know we have a very busy agenda. I'll hand over to Chinhan, who'll share a little bit of Malaysian context, and then Jim will go through the meat of today's discussion. Chinhan?
Yeah, hi everyone. I think the last session we focused on the issues and what people were going through. And really the highlight is the session today by Jim. We talked a little bit about authenticity as a leader, the importance to communicate, and weirdly, some of you picked up that I brought up rock and roll changing the world. So those were the three highlights for me from the first session. Jim will really focus on what we feel as WTW organizations need to do to succeed, and indeed maybe even flourish, in the new normal. All of these issues are affecting different companies and different industries in different ways. My team and I were talking just this morning that for the industries and companies who are struggling and facing a challenge, they definitely need to pay attention to what Jim is going to talk about later. But equally, the organizations who are going to see growth from this current situation, logistics companies, e-commerce platforms, and so forth, they need to take advantage of the current situation, right? If not, they get left behind. So I think whether you're going to be facing challenges or viewing this as an opportunity moving forward, I think the reality of it is going to change for all organizations. And Jim will focus on some of our thoughts on this. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Jim. I think learning from our previous session, we're going to have the presentation, and then probably spend a little bit more time on the Q&As, and we'll address that at the end of the session as well. Okay, so Jim, over to you with the slides as well. Jim?
Sorry, I was on mute. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, thank you for joining into our part 2 COVID series. So essentially what we'll be covering today will be our 3-part aspects of our framework that we shared last week. So a lot of the focus today is going to be on the third part of the 3-part model. But what is important here is that through this conversation, I think what you get to see is that there are 4 key imperatives that I would like to leave with you guys. I'm getting a bit of a freeze from the streaming. Is everyone able to see me or give me an indication?
Jim, we can see you.
But no slides, yeah.
Okay, let me perhaps share the slides.
And once the slides come on board, Jim, you can tell people you did this intentionally to show the new normal way of working.
All right, guys. I hope you can all see the slides now. And if you look at what we have today, essentially we're going to be covering most of what we shared from last week. And as a continuation from today's session is that we're going to be focusing on the third aspects of managing post-operating crisis. So some of the key things here that I'd like to quickly recap is that the last time when we spoke, we said that you need to have a clear exit strategy, especially coming out of this lockdown and moving forward with organizations and businesses. So quite clearly, there were a few things that we needed to prioritize in terms of how do we manage employees as well as the way of working. The second thing here is that there's not going to be one size fit all for the solutions that we're going to be looking at. Different businesses at different stages of growth, including businesses that are in stable, moderate, or even highly impacted by the COVID situation, will see a lot of different approaches that they will be having to employ. Then, of course, there is the question about it is a defining moment for leaders. So the principles and values that you set on from the very start would bring about a very good segue towards the kind of things that you want to be doing for the rest of the organization and where the organization is headed. And the next one here is that we also talked about the importance in terms of the intersection between employees and well-being of the company as well as employees. So taking these two elements together and making sure that we engage all stakeholders to understand what are the shifting priorities that needs to be established. But last but not least, I think one of the more important things is that remain agile and being able to drive long-term sustainability. So those are some of the key things that we shared from the last part 1 of our series. And following that series, I think there were a few key questions that were asked by many of you. And if I were to sum it up, there were 4 key areas that we were talked about. One around the Malaysian context in terms of unemployment, some of the statistics. So very quickly, I think depending on the various industries that we're looking at, it ranges between 10 to up to 30% in terms of that impact. And if you look at it, the areas regarding food services and things that have an impact to tourism and entertainment has one of the largest impact to it. And the second area here is that we look at was about business performance and workforce impact, right? So people talk about how that will change in terms of the operating model, the balance in terms of cost cutting, and then also balancing between health of employees and also the low touch economy. How do we get ourselves prepared for that, right? And the third thing here was about leadership requirements and trust, right? So the mindset of leaders, how do we foster trust between employees and management, and also how do we operate in a VUCA world? And last but not least, there were things around skill sets and talent, and how do we operate in the new normal? So what we try to address here today is try to cover all these 3 to 4 areas. And I would believe that the 4 imperatives that I'll be sharing with you later will have a good insight in terms of how are we going to be organizing all of this in a more structured and purposeful manner. So again, very quickly, 3 steps, 3 distinct stages that we're looking at. Where we'll be focusing is really on the third one here today, while we draw back some of the experience we got from the first 2, but the focus will be on the third one as we move along. And as we go into the third section or the third part of this stage, there are a few things that I would like to set basically the backdrop here, right? Because if you look at a lot of these organizations, what actually has happened is that we have gone through a very significant impact to how the businesses are going through what I call a downturn, right? So economies are impacted, companies are impacted, industries are impacted, and all these various businesses and countries and economies all will go through either a V curve, will go through a U curve, or even sometimes an L curve in terms of the time that you will go through, as well as the recovery phases that you will go through. But nevertheless, if you look closer down into any of these companies, I think one of the things that we can learn from history is that many of these companies that emerge stronger relied a lot on what we call innovation. And innovation here, therefore, is key with regards to how companies are going to survive. So you could see that in this setting of innovation, I mean, I was just watching a movie over the weekend on Ford versus Ferrari. And what was very interesting was that it shared a little bit of insight in terms of how businesses who has gone through turmoils during the 60s, the 70s, and how have they recovered through that process. And that story was telling about how in the Ford story that Shelby, the main character here, Carroll Shelby, started that American racing dream competing against the Europeans in the Le Mans 24 hours, and Ford emerging, winning the next 4 years of Le Mans 24 hours racing, from basically re-innovating how they are looking at their cars and in terms of motorsport. But one of the key things from that learning was that it was a lot to do with the ways of working in terms of how they brought about the innovation. Because Ford, being a very large company, actually relied on many levels of work and also many committees to make decisions. But what and how the Shelby team was able to bring the GT40 racing to the world was that they were able to re-look at the way of working by flattening the structure, being more agile, and making decisions faster, especially in the time of crisis when they were losing races at the start. So if we fast forward this situation into what we're experiencing today, you'll find that the COVID outbreak has actually forced organization into one of the most significant social experiment of how future work can be in action. So with things such as working from home and having social distancing policy radically changing our work and our interaction, this impact has a far more outreaching change, not only just to where we work, but also altering what work is performed and how we perform it. So the changes alone on where we work is actually one part of it, but actually what work is performed and how we perform it is very critical. So as I share with you the next couple of slides, I really want to touch on the importance of how this change will have an impact, and also draw to you that you cannot imagine that in the last couple of weeks that even many organizations has started to adapt, started to innovate, and started to change the things that they do, right? Sometimes I call this as necessity as the mother of all invention, right? Because even in Malaysia, you see that restaurants, they are pushing the waiters to relook at doing food delivery. And I'm not sure if you heard of this company that actually weaves songkets, right? Traditional attire, and are now sewing gowns and surgical masks, right? And also over-the-counter sales have also now started to transform into e-commerce, warehousing, marketing, and distribution. So a lot of this innovation are taking shape as companies find means of surviving in the new normal. So if I bring you to the 4 imperatives, there are 4 things that I wanted to share with you in this story that I shared about innovation and how organizations are adapting to the new way of working. So the first thing here is that if you look at how we have been operating of late, one of the key things that companies need to ask of themselves is that, how do we redefine our core? And in redefining our core, the main purpose here is that we need to find means, a very targeted means in terms of how do we recover revenue or rapidly recover revenue back to the pre-COVID levels times. So if you think about that on the forefront, redefining the core here requires us to rethink what is our operating core, right? Our operating model. And if today we rely a lot on high touch point type of approaches to our customers and clients, then very likely that process or that approach that we're taking is likely going to be not as possible in this new normal. So it takes a very different type of leadership to basically rethink of some of these things that we're doing today. So I share with you one example of an industry that that is pretty common in the Malaysian context, right? So there was some of these companies that deals with what we call like 3S centers, right? Dealing with supply of machineries and cars and also vehicles for heavy duty use as well as for consumer day-to-day use. So if you look at some of these examples here, you find that the typical things are like your Caterpillar products. You look at your Honda cars, you look at your Toyota cars, and all those companies. So a lot of these companies actually rely on a branch network to basically reach to their customers. But one of the key things one of these company has done is that they actually have almost like a 20 to 25 branch network across Malaysia. And the idea that they're taking on board is that they're changing their operating core from a geographically driven model towards what we call a more product and service type of model. It means to say that they're removing all their branches and they're going down the path of actually reaching out to their customers through what we call centers of excellence. So they brought it down to 3 to 4 centers of excellence. And they have converted all their service centers into mobile service units. So they have these mobile service units going to these various locations where their customers are. And sometimes customers do move and change their location depending on their needs of their businesses. So this mobility actually gives them the opportunity to serve their customers without having to have physical branches. So that shift in terms of their operating core gives them the opportunity to adapt to the new normal. Then the second thing as well is that they also deal with a lot of what we sometimes call spare parts, right? For the vehicles that they sell, for the machinery that they sell. So a lot of these branches that they operate out of is sometimes known as in Malay kedai alat ganti lah, you know. And what they've done is that a lot of that channels that they've gone through using this spare parts shops and all that has now changed. And they're looking at basically going down to the marketplaces, the e-marketplaces, and converting basically the over-the-counter stuff towards dealing with e-commerce, dealing with warehousing, dealing with online marketing, and dealing with distribution, right? So that shift takes a change in terms of the capability because of the channels that they reach out to their customers. But what is also important here is as well is that if you look at the typical core processes of this organization and its steering processes, two very main things that changed for them was that, number one, basically that the way that they go to market and the kind of skill sets that they require has now shifted, right? So they rely a lot more on digital way, rely more on data in terms of where companies are moving and growing with regards to the needs of their machinery and business, so that their mobile units can then fit to that requirements of where the businesses is headed. So you can see that they are very targeted towards how do they rapidly recover revenue by focusing in terms of where the customers and businesses are. But more importantly here as well is that the steering processes that they apply with it to enable the business. So one thing that they have very typically out of this is that they have these mobile units whereby they can't actually have field engineers at every mobile unit. So they have technicians. But what they do is that they have a master engineer who sits at the HQ that uses things like head-up displays as well as let's say Google glasses to basically be able to have a view of the situation and also to guide how the technicians are able to service and repair those vehicles. So taking a dramatic change in terms of shift in terms of their core to basically look at rapidly recovering revenue. But in terms of getting to that stage, the other thing that is very important here is that how they are able to make work portable, which I will cover again in a bit more detail in my subsequent slide, because I think what you got to take away from this is that as a business owner, business leader, or an organization, how do we rethink about how we operate? And second thing here is that as we rethink how we operate, there's going to be changes in terms of the activities that we do, in terms of what are the things that we can automate, what are the things that we still require human intervention, what are the things that we can effectively augment or even work collaboratively with human and machine to get more value, right? And that would then lead us to say that the future of how we manage our talent, how we build our capabilities are not going to be relying purely on the principles of just buying or building people. Meaning to say, what most organizations do is that, well, if I don't have the capability, I don't have the talent, just go there and hire or develop some of this talent internally. So the point here is that you want to start expanding your talent repertoire. So expanding your repertoire in terms of how you're going to find alternative talent models. So this includes things like the gig economy, the contingent workforce, looking at freelancers, using people who are able to provide you certain advice or certain skills at a certain time, at a certain place, right? And last but not least, this whole thing also requires a bit of that reset in terms of culture and experience. So I'll run through a little bit in more detail in terms of these 2, 3, and 4, as I set this context for what organization needs to go through in terms of the new normal. So if you look at the first one in terms of reinventing jobs, I think when we start to move from our traditional job leveling and jobs that are created based on a more hierarchical model, we start to see that the jobs gets reinvented into what we call work outcomes. And this process here requires organizations to relook and say that how do I deconstruct jobs, reevaluate them, optimize them, and look at talent reskilling. But in this process, most of the time when people go through this, they often just looking at the organization value from improving things that are typical in nature of getting errors corrected. So how do I move from something that creates a lot of errors to something that's more consistent, more constant in terms of value? But what is missing here is that job bringing you the incremental value, or bringing you the exponential value that when you go through this reinvention of jobs. So I think I shared this in the last, I shared this briefly in the last part one when there was a Q&A about skills and all those things. But I think in this part two here that I'm sharing with you, I'm giving you guys a little bit more insights with regards to how that typical reinvention happens, especially in a situation of, let's say, a bank teller job. And this is also very similar to the case that I shared with you earlier, that where the retailer of machinery and cars was able to find ways of augmenting the way that they service and provide after sales service to their customers. So in this example here, you find that any job that we look at in the traditional way typically have a few components to it. So the two main components you'll find here is primarily the things that are more technical in nature. So what are the transactional, the activities that we need to do to basically produce the work output. Then second thing that you'll find very common in any jobs is therefore the human element to it. That means the customer interaction or the internal customer interaction, or even having to deal with people over the phone lines and all those things. So that is where the human element of it. But what is interesting here is that there's also going to be that combination of between human as well as machine, right? So when we break this thing down in terms of reinventing jobs, and you take this example, as an example, you find that there'll be repetitive areas inside the whole activities that can be automated by machine. And you really want to retain the parts that are going to be only done by human. But what is critical here is that there's going to be some parts here where you will find that you can actually bring up exponential increase in value by getting both the inputs from the machine, such as the analysis, the data analytics, to then support it with a higher degree of, say, customer management, right? So in this process here, you're bringing further value to the table. And it's the same as how that company who have converted the over-the-counter parts person who is dealing with people on a face-to-face basis have now gone towards the e-commerce as a channel towards delivering that. So in that process, they have also relooked at which parts of it can be automated by machines, which part of it will still retain the customer interaction experience, and which part of it is that I can find more value by understanding the two together or bringing the two together. So as we navigate that in terms of reinventing of jobs and also basically what I call reinvented work, it's going to bring us basically to the third part here, whereby I talk a lot about the earlier elements of how organizations are going to basically take what I call sometimes that reset, right? After you make work portable, right? Is that they're going to go through this element of resetting the way their culture and experience is going to be served by the people, right? And when you go through the experience, you'll find that there's actually a few sets of workforce that's going to come out of it. So one set of workforce here is your existing people who work with you. But the other feature of those workforce is that you're going to have people who's going to come in as contingent workforce, people are going to come in as freelancers, people are going to come in as gig economy holders. But the key question here is that when you have this group of people, you're going to be experiencing a totally different culture and experience that you're going to be giving both out to these people, as well as getting that purpose and value that you're looking for. So at Willis Towers Watson, I think one of the things that we are saying here is that you're going to go through what we call sometimes a reset, because people are going to have a different feeling and they're going to basically have a different experience, and they're going to basically link to how that purpose and value is with your organization. And more importantly here, there are two things that's going to come out of it. One is that how do they connect to the organization, and two, how do they start contributing to the organization. So if you look at this journey here, and this is this is a very common journey in terms of change management. So we all know this, that when people go through the initial change, they are going to basically go through this Sarah curve, right? The shock, the apprehension, and then the rejection before they get into acceptance. But one client that we had, which is one of the Asian telcos, they are going through what we call a process of changing their workforce from one that is typically very centric towards technical and engineering, towards one that is more customer and customer marketing centric. So they are actually trying to increase their workforce to up to at least 20-25% of their workforce that's able to do marketing and BD, to build up revenues, to build up new sources of sales. But in that process, they were not thinking of basically rehiring people, but they were saying that how do I upskill existing people? So this is part of them redefining the core, reinventing their jobs, as well as bringing together a new source of talent by upskilling. But one of the biggest challenges that they faced was that most of these people that did not come from a BD marketing background are now laden to do things that they're not used to. So you can really imagine this is a change nightmare, whereby they're going to basically go through that process of saying that reset, of saying that actually, what is my purpose and value here? What is it that how do I see myself in this organization? And more importantly, how do I see myself contributing in this organization? So the principle here is that when you go through such a change, you want to basically shorten that initial shock, denial, frustration part, and quickly get them down to the acceptance stage, right? And then the next thing here is that how do you then basically accelerate the contributing stage in terms of how do they build excellence? So in WTW, one of the key things that we look at were basically looking at the customer culture, the employee culture and experience. So two things that we say are very important in driving employees towards connecting to the business is that how do they basically be able to build the inspiration, that means the purpose that they're going to have, and the trust, that means the people have the trust to the organization. And there's different levels of this, because you have at the very bottom about achieving the essentials, and then basically getting people to understand and support, and then giving them the emphasis, what is the inclusion and collaboration, and ultimately the excellence in terms of driving the inspiration and trust. Because once you're able to get this level of connection between employees and the organization, or towards the new normal organization, the next very important thing here is that how do we support contribution, right? So how do we accelerate contribution? And this is where the work and rewards become very critical. So people will go through this journey of getting what we call equity, getting to know the organization, building up their voice and capability. And more importantly here is that they'll be able to see themselves driving in a way that helps bring value to the organization and to also achieve personal growth and ambitions, right? So this is ultimately where you want to bring your people in their 4-step journey, right? From redefining your core, getting down into making work possible, looking at talent repertoires, and finally bringing about that reset in your culture and experience, right? So beyond that, there's of course a few things that comes with it. I'm not going to go through these slides in detail, because some of this these slides actually will be made available to all of you, and you can actually go through them. So there are obviously certain additional elements to the operating post-crisis that you got to take cognizance of, especially your redesigning of your performance management and total rewards, which I shared earlier, relooking at listening strategy, and continue to enhance the well-being programs that you have, right? And then how do you then bring that down to a greater excellence in terms of non-traditional rewards, building resiliency, and also looking at work and technology integration, right? So most of these things here will be shared to you via our microsite, so you can actually have a look at it. So this actually brings me down to my conclusion that this is basically the 4 key takeaways that I'd like you all to take away from this session. And these 4 key takeaways here essentially would bring about the important question about firstly, number 1, think of innovation, think of ways of how we can relook at redefining our core, redefining the way that we work, right? And the second thing here is that act with urgency, right? Because the competition and the opportunities is a window that you do not want to miss. You want to get right into it. The third thing here is that attempt to reduce drag, improve on decision making, improve on avoiding too much multiple layers, because in the new normal, that's why we suggested that you got to make work portable. You got to make things that are towards more outcome based and towards more improved performance based, right? And last but not least, focus on getting that reset in your culture and experience, because that's going to bring about the sustainability. That's going to bring about that fear, that anxiety and anxiousness that people are going to go through, right? And that journey is going to help them connect to the business again, as well as then contribute, right? So I'll leave these 4 points with you as we go into the Q&A. And just to quickly share with you that we have also done a fair bit of literature and work in this space. As you can see that we have written a few books in this area of expertise, and also have been largely involved with the World Economic Forum in terms of the HR 4.0, an article that I think all of you should have a look. And we have also recently done some groundbreaking research in terms of what is the future of the Chief People Officer. And this was done globally with SHRM and with Estelle Watson. All this information is actually available on our microsite, and happy to send some of this to all of you if it is not available there, right? So I will stop now and open the floor for questions.
Thanks a lot for that, Jim. Definitely a continuation of what we were hearing last week, and I think there's a lot of certain areas that definitely have to have emphasis. We'd like to ask if Shai and Jinhan would also like to join us for the Q&A session. The two of them are just sitting there. But whatever it is, let's just start with one question that we got fairly early on, actually, from Jalalu, who says that, unsurprisingly, we talk a lot about the easing of the MCO, right? In fact, you're back in the office, aren't you? Jim, you're back in the office, aren't you?
Yes, I'm back in the office. That's right. Sorry,
does it feel a bit strange?
Well, it feels a bit empty.
But that's going to be the new norm, I think, for a lot of us. Anyway, I've got this question up from Jialelu, and she actually says that, with the easing of the MCO and employees back into office, organizations may now to accept that this is the new norm, that part of it working from home, part of it working in the office is what people like in terms of work-life balance. Having said this, what are the key areas the organization must quickly review, adjust, and adapt and implement to ensure there's no leakages and business and it goes through?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. Sorry, maybe I'll get the ball rolling, and Chinan, Jim, please jump in. There's a little bit of echo, so we will stay on mute while we're not talking. So this is a great question about what else do organizations need to think about as we're thinking about the new normal. And yes, there are the obvious ones that sort of talk about, or maybe one way of thinking about this is in a few different buckets. Bucket one would definitely be around technology, as in if more people are going to work remotely, the technology needs to support it. Your governance mechanisms around technology need to support it. There were a lot of concerns in the last few days about different web um, video conferencing platforms having either security breaches or whatnot. And these technology companies have responded very quickly, and some of the security breaches have been taken care of. So first of all is definitely either investment in technology or adopting new technology and allowing that mindset change that people can actually work from home. Second is related to governance. And by governance, I mean both cybersecurity, technology governance, but also governance around how work gets done, governance around protocols, handovers between people. If people are working remotely more often, sort of how do we ensure that our typical governance processes, checks and balances, management sign-offs get done and sort of there's no leakage there. But third, and probably most important, is a mindset shift. A mindset shift that occurs few areas. Number one is in an Asian context, there is always this view that if somebody is not in the office, then they're slacking off or they're not pulling their weight. I think a big mindset shift that all of us need to make is just because we don't see a colleague or just because we don't see one of our subordinates sitting next to us doesn't mean that they're not working. And with this mindset shift comes a very high degree of trust. Trust in all our employees, trust in all our colleagues that each one of us is doing our job to make sure that the collective whole succeeds. And I fully appreciate that that's easier said than done. But with this mindset shift of empowerment and trust also comes very different ways of working. We've spoken about agile working structures. We've spoken about sort of decentralized working models. Very likely in the future, we will also see elimination of middle management levels, or rather reduction in middle management levels because of much stronger empowerment-based ways of working. So rather than sort of your traditional hierarchical structures, you will likely see organizations work towards more tribes and bands and project teams and use that as a way of getting work done. And final point is, I guess, how work gets done will also differ. So in the past, the way work got done, our definition of quote unquote the workforce was essentially employees. Going forward, Willis Towers Watson actually has a view that there will be 8 different categories of resources that you can use to get work done. And I won't go through all of them, but just to give you some example, employees is one, absolutely. Robotics or RPA or robotic process automation, that's 2. Number 3, artificial intelligence, machine learning. Number 4, freelancer gig economy. Number 5, crowdsourcing. Number 6, actually even working with ecosystem partners, supply chain partners, sometimes even competitors to get work done. So there are quite a few different ways in which the nature of work is also evolving. And so to answer that question about what do organizations need to do to equip themselves, I would put those in those 4 buckets. Bucket 1, people. Bucket 2, process. Bucket 3, structure. And bucket 4, which is probably the most important, is trust and mindset.
Do you have any of the other gentlemen?
Yeah, I think it's exactly right, Shai. And the flip side to this is also, I've got clients, and I myself am realizing, rather than worry about making sure that everybody's working hard, so to speak, this is actually a good opportunity to see who you actually need and who you actually don't need. And I've had CEOs say this to me as well, right? I mean, the ones who are working, and if everything's moving along, and you've worked with, let's say, 4 out of your 7 or 8 managers, and everything seems to be working, maybe it's time to re-examine what the other 3 managers are actually doing, right? I mean, rather than worry about them working, so to speak, it's actually a good time to actually see who is actually important, and the output, is required as part of doing business, So that's a slightly different way of looking at it, but it's an interesting time. I think lots of sociologists, academics, they're also looking through this period and seeing how things are being affected and how, even the climate or organizations are changing.
With that, we have a question from Francis Poe about how, aside from actually, you were mentioning, yes, technology, what platform to go on, how to facilitate this kind of thing. Francis Poe asks, in terms of human capital, besides the upskilling, I mean, it's very easy just to say upskilling, but what is the main critical success factor in terms of human capital, when you consider when you reopen your business back up? Chin Han was just mentioning, right? It's like maybe this is a good time to see where maybe your resources can be more effectively deployed. But is there sort of a one size fits all answer besides just saying like upskilling or making sure people are more effectively deployed?
Yeah, I think just to carry on that train of thought, it's definitely there's no one size fits all, right? So in our studies, industries, it's affected some companies within those industries more than others, right? So there's no one size fits all by industry across all industry, and there's by no means one size fits all even within an industry. So in fact, the idea behind this is, and again back to the point I made at the beginning. For the companies who are challenged by it, there's a set of things that you need to do. For companies for whom there is an opportunity, there are things for them to do as well. So it's really not just upskilling. It's not, if you know, one of the things that Jim talked about was in terms of looking at the new talent model, right? So it's not just about reskilling, replacing people, rehiring them or whatever, the same old talent models we had before. Use contract workers, consider using technology. Technology is a big thing. You can't catch a virus from it. Well, you can catch a virus from technology, but not the type that puts you in hospital. But these are all the things that we need to look at. So by no means is there a one size fits all.
Yeah, and if I can add to that point as well, I think that one of the cornerstones of how we see this as well is that I think as business leaders from a human capital or from a workforce perspective is really to relook at how you want to move from if your business is in a high touch point type of model into a lower touch point type of model that you can change or shift, right? So if you look at some of the examples I shared with you earlier about those companies that have actually changed the way they work and relook at redefining their core, but still in the same type of business, is what business leaders should firstly think of, right? Because that will then guide them in terms of the kind of talent decisions that they make. And those talent decisions beyond the typical buying and hiring or even upskilling or retraining will then emerge, because they'll start to see that my business is now moving towards a different landscape. It will require a different type of core processes. It will require a different type of steering processes. And therefore, if I relook at the way that I'm working today, I got to make that work portable. I got to make that work exchangeable. And with that exchangeability, I'm also going to be able to see the kind of skills that I need that I can just borrow from the market, the kind of skills that I can actually just automate if I need to, right? So a lot of leaders, while they think of saying that, yeah, we're going through this problem, but they're not actually taking that step of saying that, how do I redefine my core? And therefore, how do I make the jobs that I have portable and more outcome-based versus more job-level based? And then how do I then break that into pieces where I can then outsource, I can then reskill, I can then automate, or I can then change the way that I'm working, right? So back to Francis' question here, I think those would, to me, some of the principles or critical success factors that I think organizations can adopt and take on.
I have a bunch of questions here as we move on, actually considering the board, because EW asks, what oversight role does the board play in relation to human capital in the new norm? And this is kind of a little bit echoed or expanded on by Chin Sui Fang, who says that the thing is, talking about Asian culture, right? Chai, the hierarchical culture is so prevalent, it's embedded. And as much as we try to actually flatten our structures, we find ourselves falling back into very familiar patterns as to who is the boss, literally, right? But it doesn't, this hierarchical culture doesn't sit well with the need for like an organizational simplification in the new norm. So what advice do you have for boards on how to sort of change this mindset?
These are both great questions, and they are related but slightly nuanced in the two questions. So I'll try to address the two comments separately. One, how do we make, or rather, how do we encourage boards to pay closer attention to human capital? And this could be a separate webinar all in itself. If not, please come over for dinner and we could have a conversation that lasts a few hours about this, because this is a subject that I feel very passionate about. We all feel very passionate about. There is an old adage that what gets measured gets done. There is also another adage, and particularly for those of us who worked in financial services, the best or the easiest way to get something done is to put it in the CEO scorecard. And why I'm sharing these two comments is for boards and management teams to take this more seriously. We fundamentally believe that going forward, management teams will need to be incentivized and actually held accountable for their performance on human capital related measures. And what I mean by that is not incentivized or not KPIs that are merely window dressing. Because even right now, a lot of companies would have performance measures or KPIs, let's say 5% weighting in the CEO scorecard, or in some cases we've seen 1.25% weighting in CEO scorecard. To me, those are window dressing measures, and sort of they don't really affect true positive change. However, going forward, given how COVID-19, and we said this last time, and at the risk of repeating myself, I'll say this again, COVID-19 and everything that has followed, economic crisis, social crisis, lockdowns, everything, fundamentally, we believe all of that is a human capital crisis. The strain that we are seeing on the economic system, on social systems, is not because of a significant market failure in financial systems or tariffs or trade concerns, or God forbid our generation never experiences this, but things related to war or it's the crisis has got nothing to do with past crises. Past crises always had a trigger. Past crises, may it be the dot-com bubble, may it be the global financial crisis, may it be September 9/11, all of them had a very different trigger. COVID-19, first and foremost, is a human capital crisis. It has incapacitated, at a global scale, the biggest source of capital for any company, which is its people. And this has made it very clear that organizations in the past have put a lot more emphasis on their technology capital, their financial capital, their physical capital. Going forward, the emphasis will need to be on human capital, at least equal, if not more. And how to get that done is personally a significant portion of what you focus management's attention for and what you rewarded them should be linked to human capital development. And by significant, I mean certainly at least a quarter to a third of their overall compensation, their performance management, their KPIs should be linked to people measures. People measures that are both leading indicators as well as lagging indicators. So we may have things such as employee engagement, retention, which are the traditional human capital measures, but more importantly, measures such as employee well-being, upskilling, reskilling, or portability of skills, looking at employees' careers that extend beyond just your own organization. And I think some of those measures are fundamentally important. So maybe that's part A of the two-part question about what can companies do and boards do to make this more meaningful. And boards, certainly the best way of doing this is A, believing in it yourself and believing in that this is important, but B, then linking it to compensation frameworks, performance management frameworks, and expectations from management. Part B, which was related to, before we move to part B, Chinhan, Jim, anything else you want to add?
I was just going to say that at the end of the day, the chairman plays a huge part in this, right? So while the board might want to do it, certain board members or so forth, I think if the chairman is not of that thinking, then it's going to be hard, regardless of what you put in place. So I think choice of chairman, we've seen ourselves, with a change in chairman, the change in culture occurs, and then these kind of good things happen. But so it's a combination of getting the right individual, putting in place some of these KPIs, so to speak, but also maybe a bit of education to a chairman who's open to this, and then you have a higher chance of any of these changes happening. I mean, this is just my own experience.
And that's a great point. And maybe this is a short answer to the second part of the question about how do we circumvent some of the hierarchical Asian bias. We could go a very long-winded answer with a lot more principles, but I think Jinan just nailed it in his response that a lot of this starts with the chair and the board. And maybe Nadia, I'll just give you one perspective, which is hopefully a short way of illustrating the point, that chairs and board members, first and foremost, need to stop thinking of themselves as bosses. They are stewards, they are not bosses. Shareholders are bosses. Board members are stewards appointed on behalf of shareholders, but the person running the company is the CEO. And quite often we've seen in an Asian context, board members, chairs, thinking of them as the boss. That's the mindset shift that also needs to happen. They are the stewards, not the boss.
Actually, they're not continuing on, but Jennifer Tien actually has this really interesting point. She is asking for real world examples, how ready, willing, poised Malaysian companies are to embrace major transformation. Can you actually give maybe a short example of a company that did a pivot and actually, came out on the other side?
We just talked about it this morning, Jim. So without naming the company, can you just kind of tell us what you've been working with the CEO on in terms of some of the repivoting? I mean, the outcome is unclear at this point, but this is what they've decided to do with the experience of the last 6 weeks. And I think it's worth sharing some of it without going into details, please, Jim.
Yeah, so this is the same example I shared during the talk. That this company that, without naming them, they actually have 20 over branches dealing with machinery and equipment as well as vehicles for the construction industry. So they have gone through what we call a change in their core by redefining what is it that they, the way that they are serving customers. So traditionally, they always had their branches located or co-located closer to where their customers are. But they later realized that their customers keeps shifting or moving because the customers' projects and plans and things that they do are quite dynamic in nature. So hence, they were not able to catch up and also keep up with the kind of operating costs or cash flows that they required. So what they did is that they decided to move down to mobile units and mobile servicing units, whereby they are able to follow the customers and provide very quick and direct access to post sales services, as well as any new sales and services that they require. And they also migrated that operating model towards more what we call the center of excellence, so that they only have, let's say, 3 to 4 centers across Malaysia where the customers can actually come in and use them. And another very great thing about them is that they also converted a lot of their part sales into e-commerce, into buying online, buying through no longer through the over the counter. And the last but not least, one of the more interesting things they did is that they have centralized their master engineers or their master technicians to provide the oversight of skills and capability to their local technicians at the mobile units through using HUDs and so on and so forth.
We have one. Sorry, Chinhana, do you have something to say?
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, this is not some low-tech company, right? This is a company that's operated, I mean, this brand is around for like more than 60, 70 years. dealing with machinery. So it's not one of those traditionally flexible time of can pivot on a dime kind of company. So if these companies can actually do it, I think all companies can. You know, this is a very old brand, very old company. Something that we need to remember.
And maybe just to give you a regional global perspective, again, apologies, we won't be able to share client names given confidentiality, but some of this, particularly, the methodology that Jim was referring to, we actually refer to it as reinventing jobs methodology. So essentially, we deconstruct jobs into core components and tasks, look at what part of the job can be automated, what can be augmented, what can be outsourced, and we reconstruct jobs back, because then you're building jobs for the future. And not only sort of do we have some software solutions for clients that can do it themselves, but we've been doing this with clients across multiple industries, multiple levels of client maturity. So from some of the Standard & Poor's top 100 listed companies in the US, so ones with sort of few $100 billion market cap, to Malaysian companies, to companies in Southeast Asia. I think the example Chinan was referring to, sort of some of these are publicly listed companies, some are family founded companies. We're even doing this work for one of the actually couple of public sector agencies in Singapore. We're actually redefining public sector jobs on this framework. So there are several examples of this actually being real and not just theoretical, where companies have gone through this and come out on the other side. In quite a few of these cases, as you can imagine, though, one of the drivers is transformation, or the need for transformation. So success of some of this, I think it's still too early to say, because while companies start seeing some quick wins, for this to be truly successful, it needs to be sustainable on a long-term basis. So as the transformation journey unfolds, 3-5 year transformations, we will see some successes, some failures, but a lot of learnings.
Actually, following on from that too, Dr. Mustakiza, we're going to wrap up soon, gentlemen. But I actually liked this question because it's something that plays on my mind quite often. What is the balance? How can we balance between having a healthy nation, fighting back this nameless enemy, and recovering economic activity? What is the balance between the two? There has been so much discussion, whether online or radicalized or weaponized by a lot of political people. Is there a balance between making sure that we have this pandemic under control and going back to work? What do we need to do to balance that, especially as a company?
So I'll let Chinan and Jim close with sort of the Malaysian context. But fully appreciate the question and the nuance here. But if done right, the two priorities actually should not be competing with each other. Going back to work should actually be aligned with reinventing work and thinking and future-proofing work. Because even, this is public domain now, even the Singapore Prime Minister sort of made the comment that even as people return back to work, working from home is going to start being the new normal. And I just don't mean working from home versus working from office, but rethinking about how work gets done, investing in human capital development, investing in environmental, social governance measures, investing in different ways of getting work done. If done well, actually that should not be a competing priority with national recovery. That should be actually a trigger for longer term national recovery.
Yeah, and just a thought to this is, it's not, as Shai said, it's not one or the other. You'll never get it right. If you're gonna wait to get it right before you take your next step, it's just never gonna happen. So it's a matter of learning as it goes along. I think one of the things that all organizations need to do, because again, there are some assumptions to how we're going to operate moving forward. There are going to be recurrences of this COVID thing itself. There could be new viruses. There could be new situations that arise. But I think the one thing is clear. All organizations are starting to realize that things which you always think is not going to happen in this lifetime, it's already happened. So, and it's happened once, So if we should really be be preparing for this moving forward. So I think the idea is not to try and get everything right before we move on. It's just moving on with the best we can. Follow some guiding principles around sustainability of the operations, as well as with the employees, as well as with the community, and then just be open to change tack as it may. And basically just keep checking back with employees, checking back with your clients, checking back with your stakeholders, and within your ecosystem, and then I think you'll be able to manage as best you can.
All right. I have just one point to add to that question. Obviously it's hard to find that balance and to actually strike that balance, right? But I think the main principle that I like to share is that whatever that we do in terms of achieving that balance has, to me, to be done in good faith, and those decisions that are done based on good faith would then prevail, especially in these sort of situations, right? And if we overly think about it and we go to one extreme, actions are taken purely from an economic perspective, then we of course will lose the health and that vitality of people, right? And vice versa as well, that if we go all the way out to the other extreme, then we will lose out on the other things that we have economically. So that balance, I believe, have to be done on the principle of good faith.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no playbook for this. So maybe applying a analogy from software development, sort of looking at a MVP, minimal viable product, to re-entering or emerging from this, I think is going to be key, and to iterate and apply lessons that you learned during the process.
And with that, we've come to the end. I think that's a great note to end it on, gentlemen, of today's webinar. Thank you so much for all your insights, your valuable insights, not just today, but over the past week as well. I think we are all in uncharted waters. That's not an exaggeration. We're all trying to grasp on to what maybe we think might work, but I think the inevitability of it is, even if you do make mistakes, the thing is to learn from it and sort of move forward. Thank you so much to all the attendees for your participation and all of the great questions. Greatly apologize that we're not able to accommodate everyone, but your participation, your queries, so much appreciated. But feel free to go through the chat box. There is actually quite a bit of interesting information there as well, because we'd love to hear from you. Please use the survey link in the chat box, or there's a QR code for you guys to scan as well if you want to give your feedback and also maybe suggest topics of interest. And here's just a little extra. There'll be a virtual classroom. ICDM is bringing a virtual classroom starting from May 6th, because following this series, there should be a space where boards and directors can kind of sit down, chew on it a bit more, do a bit more deeper analysis as to what we can do to manage the companies during these trying times. If you actually are interested, you can register your interest at development@icdm.com.my or visit icdm.com.my. With it, that is it from this week. It has been my absolute pleasure to be your moderator through this all. Everyone, please stay safe when you go out, and have a good week ahead.
And before we end, I just want to say a big thank you to Nadia. You've been an excellent moderator, and a big thank you to ICDM for taking the mantle and raising these really important issues. So thank you, ICDM and Nadia, and it was a pleasure being here.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. All have a good week.
Bye.